Welcome to this Easy 11 Plus short lesson on how to explain a personal impression of a text in written comprehension, such as, for example, that something in the passage is exciting. As always, the worksheet for today's lesson is linked in the video description, along with lots of other useful resources that you might like to explore. My Easy 11 Plus live lessons are every Tuesday evening at 6 o'clock, and if you find this video useful, please remember to like, subscribe, and click the bell button. Okay. Let's get started. The question asks us to explain how LeBlond makes lines 21 to 25 exciting, and it's very clear that we need to look at two specific examples from the text. There are 4 marks available, which means that we need a relatively brief but clear explanation of each example. So we need to go into the text and find our ideas. We can see that lines 21 to 25 are here, and it makes sense to put a bracket around those so that we can keep focusing on the right area. Let's read this. We advanced a yard or two further, and then the entire surface upon which we stood commenced to move. A moment more and we were struggling for our lives, dashing our axes through the rushing snow and endeavouring to arrest our wild career, which, unless checked at once, would cause us to be precipitated down the entire face of the mountain to the glacier below. Okay, so this is inherently a very dramatic and exciting event. And that makes it rather difficult to talk about, because when it's so obvious that something is exciting, it can be hard to find specific examples and explain why. Because bear in mind that just saying this is exciting because they are in danger isn't really a textual analysis. We have to get into the detail of the language. So let's find some things here that might help us. What's the first thing that looks exciting here? Well, I think it's when it says that the entire surface upon which we stood commenced to move. And let's underline commenced to move here as being maybe the key phrase in that. Perhaps we could also think about entire surface, because that shows how overwhelming the disaster was. Every part of the ground on which they stood started to slide away. A moment more and we were struggling for our lives. Well, struggling for our lives is obviously dramatic because it conveys the extreme peril that they're in. But how much is there to say about that? Well, you could talk about the word struggling and the kind of effort that shows. I think it would certainly be possible to make a point out of that. However, I'm particularly interested in this, a moment more. Because think about the contrast with what was said in the last sentence. Commenced to move, started moving, implies something that's gradual, that happens step by step. And then only a moment more and they're actually fighting not to die. And that shows how quickly this avalanche progresses from the first slip to a dramatic slide. And so that's definitely something we could talk about. So I think that's one of the points that I'm going to make. And for me, the key phrase here is a moment more, but also commence to move, which is our point of contrast. Now let's push on and think about what the second point might be. We have to talk about lines 21 to 25, so it might be a mistake just to draw our points from the first 2 lines. Dashing our axes through the rushing snow. Well, dashing, a bit like struggling, is another very violent, dramatic verb. And rushing gives us a sense of the enormous power of this snowslide, this avalanche. And endeavouring to arrest our wild career, so that means trying to stop ourselves from flying out of control, which, unless checked at once, would cause us to be precipitated down the entire face of the mountain to the glacier below. Well, there are lots of things we could talk about there. I'm particularly drawn to this phrase, be precipitated. Why? Well, it's a strange construction, because wouldn't you normally just say fall? But be precipitated makes clear that these people are being thrown down the mountain, that they are not in control, that it's nature, the mountain and the snow, that's in charge of what's happening here. And I think that sense of helplessness is something we could definitely talk about in creating a sense of jeopardy and excitement in this text. So let's think about what we can do with these ideas when it comes to putting an answer together. So let's start off with the first point about a moment more in contrast to commence to move. Now, rather than writing my evidence in the order that it's in the text, which is commence to move, then a moment more, I think a moment more is our key quotation here. A moment more is an exciting change of pace, because whereas commence to move implied a gradual slippage, it only takes a moment for the snow to start rushing and threaten people's lives. This shows the power of the avalanche. So right from the start, I've shown that I'm talking about how this is exciting, and I've clearly explained the contrast with commence to move. I've worked in short quotations along the way, moment, rushing, lives, to anchor my ideas in the text without just repeating it. All of this is part of my explanation. And then I've got a short concluding sentence just to make absolutely clear what is exciting about this, what it tells us about the avalanche that is dramatic. So it's a relatively long point for 2 marks, and perhaps it's more than necessary, but it's extremely clear and very well rooted in the text. But now we need our second point. So let's remind ourselves of that by looking back at the passage. And don't forget, when you're doing written comprehension, you should constantly be looking between your answer space and the text in order to anchor your ideas in what the author has actually written. So we were going to talk about the phrase be precipitated here. And in fact, that in itself gives us plenty to talk about. The way that the characters are shown to be helpless through this passive construction instead of an active verb like we fell. The passive construction, be precipitated, used instead of fell, shows how helpless the characters are. The avalanche controls what happens to them. So this is actually quite a simple point to write down, even though the idea behind it took a bit of thought. You could write this point down without needing to know that it's a passive construction or using that phrase, and you probably don't need to say used instead of fell, but I think that just helps to make the point really clear. What's really important is where I've explained how this is exciting, because it emphasizes the complete helplessness of these characters. And I've explained why it shows that, because the avalanche is precipitating them. So it's pushing them where it wants them to go, as it were. So there you have it. That's how you explain the emotional impression created by a moment in a text. The answer I've created here is pretty extensive for a 4-mark answer. It perhaps goes into slightly more detail than you would strictly need in most exams, but I've shown how you can mine evidence from the text and create an answer that's really interesting and really detailed and mixes explanation and evidence in a really clear and convincing way, so that no examiner could be in any doubt that you understand in detail how the author makes these events exciting. I hope that was useful. It's probably well worth printing off another copy of the worksheet and having another go to see if you can incorporate some of these ideas into your own writing, perhaps while making different points. And I hope you learned something from it. If you did, please like this video and subscribe to the channel. Please take a moment to have a look through the links in the video description, which should be useful. And I look forward to seeing you next Tuesday at 6 o'clock for my next Easy 11 Plus live lesson. Goodbye.